This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, it is another of my series on what makes this film great. Aguirre, The Wrath of God is a 1972 film by Werner Herzog. I'll be talking with Tyson Wills about it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Tyson Wills is my guest. He has a website called TysonWills.com. He's a film critic and expert. We'll be talking about Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Before we do, though, I'd like to give all my guests a few minutes to give a little bit of background about themselves and their interest in the subject. So, Tyson, welcome. If you could give a little bit of background about who you are and also about Aguirre and your interest in it.
No worries, Dan. Yeah, so I did a PhD on Werner Herzog a number of years ago. I guess my kind of love affair with Werner's films really probably began in the 1990s, late 80s, early 90s, when I was starting to explore European art cinema. And I saw a bunch of films, Nosferatu, Nicola Caspar Hauser, Aguirre, Heart of Glass. So a lot of the 1970s fictional feature films that I particularly explored. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, I really started to look into Werner's cinema much more seriously. And that's when Aguirre became really important to me. So as I said, I did my PhD on Werner, spent a long time working as a lecturer and teacher in cinema studies and media studies. I'm currently a researcher in media and a freelance academic film writer and commentator. I think among many things that attracted me to films like Aguirre, I think it was a lot of the hypnotic qualities around the presentation of landscape, a lot of the qualities about the kind of cosmic way that Herzog could bring you into this world, set loosely on a colonial expedition in South America. And I think things like the performance of Kinski was also a really compelling factor as well. But I think particularly my attraction has always been to the way that he engages with nature and engages with landscape, and the way that he physically films, I think, which is a really interesting quality of his, because while he does really trade on the idea of going in and filming physical locations and using physical sets and non-actors as a kind of realism to his films, at the same time he tries to elevate that realism into something poetical and mysterious. So those sorts of qualities really attracted me quite early on.
So let's talk a little bit about Herzog before we get into the film proper. So you said you have a PhD and in studying Herzog, so you're probably the best person to ask about it. Oftentimes with artists in general, but also with filmmakers, there is the sort of ramping up stage where they're a novice and they're learning the craft. Then there's usually sort of their middle period where they're at their peak. And then a lot of them do the latest stuff, which is just usually chewing over their earlier themes. Good examples of this would be Woody Allen, the last couple of decades. He's just sort of regurgitating some of his earlier stuff. Terrence Malick, for example, famously in his prime did very few films. He came back, did I think a great film with Thin Red Line and then The New World. And then the rest of the films have sort of been sliding. He's sort of just aping himself with the voiceovers and stuff. I think of Fellini's last few films. And then I think of some of the TV movies that Bergman did, like Saraband. I thought was a horrible film compared to the film supposedly that it's based on, Scenes from a Marriage. Herzog seems to have sidestepped that to a degree because he's given up fiction filmmaking. And while I do appreciate the documentaries, a part of me wishes he did more. But then I think of like Port of Call, New Orleans, and it's a solid film, but it's nowhere near the stuff he was doing in the 70s in terms of fiction. So what is your take about why he gave up fiction film basically for the last 25 or more years? And do you think it had to do with that, his trying to avoid, he just didn't have any fiction to tell?
Well, it's an interesting question. As you've identified, he has done some fictional feature films. even in the last 10 years or so. But yeah, surely it's true to say he's been very driven toward what we can call a documentary mode of presentation. We probably have to begin this conversation, though, Dan, by noting that certainly for Werner, he has long traded on the idea of blurring fiction and reality. And for him, there's not necessarily a clear distinction between documentary and fictional feature filmmaking. So that's probably something to note from the get-go. And he's really kind of worked in documentary since the beginning of his career. So it's really been something that's been with him for a long time. I think maybe part of the secret is that he's always been attracted, as I identified a bit earlier, about non-actors, physical locations. He likes to work with real historical facts or real people. He wants to certainly be able to be creative with those people and situations. So he loves to, use fabrication, use illusion. He certainly wants to fictionalize the real things in life. So maybe part of the reason why he's consistently stayed attracted to documentary is a lot more to do with just his interest in poeticizing real events and real people. And maybe that mode suits him well. But we should keep in mind that from his perspective, there's not always a clear distinction between fiction and documentary. So he will say things like, for example, Fitzcarraldo is one of his best documentaries. Now, we can always take Werner with a grain of salt sometimes. Obviously, he's a provocateur. Obviously, he's an artist outside of his films, and he's performing a certain kind of persona all the time. And even in his distribution through his own website, he still has to classify some films as documentary and some as fictional. So even he has to rely on some of those categories. But throughout his career, he's been very interested in blurring those boundaries, I think, a lot. And as I say, I think there's been a lot of attraction to using real things that exist in the world, locations you can visit and those sorts of things, and then wanting to poeticize them. And so maybe that's part of the reason why documentary has been something he's been particularly attracted to.
Yeah, certainly with things like the Caspar Hauser film, that's based on a real incident, but he adds his own touches to it. Even Dwarf started small, which was his first film, the first film before this one. There's touches of, because I think he captured some real life things that were going on the island where they filmed, but he then incorporated that into his story that he had. But most famously, when you talk about blurring of the lines, of course, is he's of the P.T. Barnum school of self promotion. Werner Herzog eats his shoe, the little film that he made, that kind of thing. His I wanted to murder Kinski, kind of thing, and that seems to have been based on some things, but both of them seem to have blown it up 10, 15 times more than it was. So if you can talk a bit about his penchant for fabulism.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's an interesting. I think his volatile marriage with Kinski that you already referred to is emblematic of this. I mean, Klaus was obviously great at building his own myths and legends, and I think Werner too is very schooled in that. And in the documentary My Best Fiend, Werner kind of alludes to some of the fabrication that went on in Kinski's autobiography. I think since the 1970s, Werner's been really keen to create a myth around himself as an auteur, and I think in part it's a little bit of a romantic kind of drive to want to create art out of reality. So it's not just the film screening, but it's everything outside the film screening is all meant to elevate the audience into some sort of experience. Werner's very keen on creating ideas about the authenticity of the films and everything that went into making the film something magical or something poetic and ecstatic. And so I think for him, part of the drive is to create a whole reality that the audience can immerse themselves in, and everything he does outside the films, all the commentary, all the interviews, is meant to help audiences be elevated in their experience. But there's also some other more shall we say, less exotic readings, which simply say this is also part of commercial promotion as well. And I think as the idea of the auteur develops through the 70s and 80s, there's probably a lot of attention also on the commercial value of the auteur. And some scholars have compared him to someone like Francis Ford Coppola, as well as someone, something like The Heart of Darkness, where the auteur really builds this whole story around the film and becomes this larger-than-life character, almost larger than the film itself. And that, in part is a way to elevate the film and the experience that audiences can have with films, but also is a commercial strategy as well. And so we shouldn't forget that Werner, I think, is not immune to using commercial strategies, and some of his films mixing commercial kind of mainstream filmmaking with art film. He's not opposed, I don't think, necessarily to that. He loves California, he loves Hollywood, in some ways, and he loves, Fred Astaire, he loves the illusion of cinema as well. So I think he is part of that. Interestingly, in a way, he's part of that production of creating the aura of a cinematic event, even though on the same token, he's quite an independent art filmmaker as well.
Yeah, I think of his documentaries, the Grizzly Man documentary, which I don't think is one of his better ones in terms of elucidating the person, but because Treadwell himself was a Herzog-like figure in that he took, if you listen to his voice, he has that kind of Michael Jackson effeminate lisp, which a lot of people said he only did for the camera. So this was a guy who was an actor who then, is perfect material. But, I don't think it's as interesting as some of the other great. I mean, Little Dieter, I think, is a much better, much more interesting character in person than Timothy Treadwell. But so, I mean, and this gets back to Kinski, he would take these people that themselves had those tendencies, and he would sort of like add gasoline to their fire.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. And I think, many people see Herzog as the master auteur, ultimately. A lot of his films, a lot of the characters he deals with are ultimately about him wanting to say something about himself and to say something about cinema, say something about the act of seeing through the camera lens. And whether all the characters are ego ideals, I'm not always sure. And he does certainly have characters that obviously escalate into insanity and into madness. It's almost like Werner explores these different reactions to the landscape and extreme conditions through these characters and through their situations. So it's not always like a simple positive thing. In fact, often it's, we're often talking about characters who either die or go into insanity or pushed into the extremes in different ways. So he's clearly interested in that, and he clearly, I think, reads something of himself through those characters and through those situations. And in some ways, that's all part of creating a continuity for the film viewer who can read, the characters and him and the film event. It's all in a kind of seamless experience. But yeah, he's pretty consistently had very similar kinds of characters. Through Aguirre, through Casper, through Timothy Treadwell, through a whole range of different characters. The seer in Heart of Glass, and we shouldn't forget that if it's not always characters, it's sometimes landscapes that become characters in his films, and those landscapes also reveal all kinds of characteristics that he's interested in exploring through his particular male figures. And it's interesting too. That's always almost exclusively men as well. Yeah. Very, very few women in his films who feature as particular protagonists.
Yeah. Two final questions, and then we'll move on to the actual film. So regarding Kinski, I think it's very obvious that Kinski, without Herzog, would have just been a barely B-level actor. Because if you look at him in other films, whether it's some of the westerns he did, some of the later stuff before he died, some of the sort of B-science fiction films, Herzog, despite being an over-the-top personality himself, seemed to get the best out of Kinski. He knew when to restrain Kinski. For example, in Nosferatu, here in Aguirre, he knew how to when to let Kinski be Kinski and when to not let Kinski be Kinski, because in a lot of the other films, Kinski was always Kinski. You could see him as a tertiary actor, always trying to steal the scene in the background, doing something fidgeting in other films. Whereas here, Herzog seemed to know Kinski to let him go. And even though they did, I think only 5 films together, they're as associated as an actor-director pair as De Niro and Scorsese are, or Ozu and Setsuko Hara in Japan are. So just if you want to talk just a little bit about that dynamic and, how Kinski benefited from Herzog.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, obviously Kinski, I think he had his own career, though, to be honest. I mean, I think, he'd been in a lot of productions. He did have a European film career, and that also involved a lot of exploitation cinema or B cinema. As you mentioned, working across different genres, different sorts of Italian films, including some, giallo, but also, westerns. And he was already a cult figure, really, in some ways, or at least a notorious figure already by the late 60s, early 70s. And he already had his Jesus Christ tour and stuff like that. He was already doing his own spoken word. So he did bring a lot of force and attention and already notoriety before he got to Werner, I would say. But look, probably in the history of looking back over time and what we're going to remember of Klaus Kinski's performances, apart from maybe a couple of the westerns and a couple of giallos, maybe a couple of other exploitation films, there's going to be a continuous long-time association with Werner. And as we've already mentioned, they were very adept at building each other's myths and about each other and their relationship, so they really were able to feed into that. In terms of Herzog influencing, Klaus's biography and things like that. They were able, I guess, to bring a lot of, in a way, Klaus's tension that he brought on to set, his extravagances and so on, was something that Werner, as you suggested, could feed from. They could also cause a lot of problems on set, and there's a lot of stories of Werner, as you're saying, having to try and discipline Kinski because of those sorts of problems. Eventually things probably got to the point where with Cobra Verde, I think the last film they did together, where, things had really come to an end in terms of what was achievable in terms of their relationship. I think, Werner's been attracted to these sorts of figures who can do what in his mind are kind of extraordinary performances, very physical performances, quite expressive performances. And even though Klaus often talked, Klaus seemingly struggled in some of the locations he had to end up shooting in, particularly things like jungles and so on, there was always a kind of presence that I think Werner particularly benefited from and wanted in his films that he was able to get from Klaus. Trying to work through all the fiction and fact about their relationship is kind of an endless study that I don't think can come to any conclusive end, because they're both full of sometimes quite opposing stories about the sorts of things that happened on set and who actually did more for whom. So at the end of the day, Werner's going to win a lot of those battles because he's still alive and he can keep talking about it.
Well, let me just put Herzog in a context too, outside of just his films. He was part of what was called the German New Wave, and that, of course, was the French New Wave and the Japanese New Wave, Italians, and then we get Germany. And Germany, from what I could tell, post-World War II was really, for the first 20 plus years, there wasn't a hell of a lot going on creatively. Now, maybe I'm wrong. And then basically you had this trio of Herzog, Wim Wenders, and Fassbinder that, came around the same time, the late 60s, early 70s. And they are considered sort of, I guess, the trinity of that movement. Now, for me personally, I think Herzog is easily the best of the three, and the most interesting. And he, and whatnot. What just briefly, we can speak on that movement, the trio, and your assessment of the three of them, how they may have interacted or helped each other or not.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a few different waves to that new German cinema that you're referring to, and obviously we have some earlier figures like Kluger and so on. There's quite a bunch of them. You do have certain genres like in the 50s, like the Heimat film and so on. But yeah, there is the idea that after the classic Weimar period of the 1920s into the early 30s, fascism takes over, and then there's this idea that there's a big gap between kind of fascism and the new German cinema of the early 60s. Whether that entirely holds up, because there's still a lot of productions made through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there are in the Nazi period there's importation of international productions and so on. So it's not quite the gap that we often imagine. Nonetheless, clearly a lot of new German filmmakers are dealing with questions of the fascist past. They're dealing with questions of particularly film and the history of film genre in Germany. While there are a bunch of them, it's probably true to say that the trio that you mentioned, the ones that, and they're kind of the later phase of the new German cinema, are the ones that internationally are most remembered and kind of held up, I suppose, as the kind of champions and emblematic of the movement. One of the interesting things about that New Wave movement, as it was true for the French New Wave, among other things, that there's actually a lot of diversity. So, if you look at a classic Fassbinder film, you're probably going to see quite a different strain of influence and a different way of looking and dealing with issues around German identity and the American occupation and things like that compared to a Wenders or Herzog. Werner's always felt that, there was some support between the three of them, but there was often really a lot of divergence and a lot of difference in the way that they went about their filmmaking and how they articulated their experiences of the German past. Someone like, say, for example, just to give one of many examples, but, Fassbinder and Wenders probably identified with different kinds of filmmakers from the past. Wenders identifies with people like Nicholas Ray, for example, Ozu, Fassbinder, obviously influenced by someone like Douglas Sirk, for example. Werner very much loads himself in the 70s in the camp of Weimar cinema. He even does a remake of Bernau's, of course, famous Nosferatu, and he very much identifies with the German film historian Lotte H. Eisner. Fassbinder, Wenders, of course, have that history in mind as well, but I think Werner is someone who turns a lot more to that classic Weimar past. He's someone who probably turns to figures like Wagner in a way that's much more direct than some of those other new German filmmakers, and he certainly identified with a figure like Wagner in a way that's become quite problematic for some audiences over time. And he also tended to go to a lot more exotic locations than, say, someone like Fassbinder did, for example. So there's quite a divergence there, whether he, I appreciate your opinion that he might be the best. I think there's a lot of division about that. One thing's for sure, that Werner is really the only one standing at the end of that whole movement. That's for sure, and the one who's remained most prominent.
So let's pick up on the film itself. So it's odd to think that a German filmmaker would do a film about a conquistador. Not that people can't do that, but that would, a bunch of conquistadors you wouldn't think necessarily coming from Germany. And then also there's the oddity that the film made by a German filmmaker shot in South America was actually shot in English. They speak English. And then it was translated, dubbed into German and other languages. So let's talk a bit about the conception of the film by Herzog and what was it financed by Americans or by the British? Is that why it's in English, etc.?
Yeah. So look, as I understand, Werner talks about writing a script very quickly. He's got this sort of famous story on being on. I think it's a German soccer tour, and I'm not quite sure what the level of competition was, and he was kind of very drunk and hungover and wrote the script very quickly. Whether that's entirely true or not, who knows? And that he did look to some of the source material. There obviously is a historical figure called Aguirre, and there was some sort of mutiny that took place on this conquistador expedition. and there are surviving diaries that he draws from. But he also mixed it in with a lot of other sources as well. So I think there was a kind of influence from an African prince or king or something, I think, from memory, that he drew on as well. So, look, I think in some ways the reasons why films like that were getting shot in English or something like that is actually really quite characteristic of a lot of low production films during the 60s and 70s. So you get a lot of films that are shot either without dialogue, and then all the dialogue is dubbed over, or you just simply get a certain currency of language that you use, and then you can dub that afterwards as well. So I think it was really just a kind of standard production decision for that. So yeah, I think I mean a lot of Werner's, a lot of the new German cinema films are usually getting financing through actually German television during the 60s and 70s, and then maybe some international co-financing. So a lot of stuff is actually quite state subsidised during the 60s and 70s. So I couldn't tell you the exact proportions of figures for that film, but I think during this period, Werner is still receiving. I mean, he has his own production company, so he did form his own production company in the 60s, but I'm pretty sure he also received state subsidies for a lot of his work. Yeah.
So the ostensible story is that there's this group of slaves held by the conquistadors that are coming down from the Andes into the beginnings of Amazonia. The leader of the group is a real-life figure, cousin of Francisco Pizarro, and one of his lieutenants basically is this guy, Don Lope Aguirre, played by Kinski. And we start off, one of the things versus, I mean, the most obvious parallel film is going to be Apocalypse Now, which was made a few years later. I mean, it's about going down a river, the ensuing madness, the unseen enemy, just around the bend. But the thing that distinguishes this film from, I mean, Apocalypse Now, this is an opera. This is a very small tune played on a flute almost, if we're going to compare them. And you get that sense right from the beginning when they're coming down the mountains. You can almost feel the sweat on them. You can, there's a very cinema verite feel to the film. Was this filmed with just one or two cameras then? This wasn't a big production then?
No, that's right. It was only one camera, I think. And Werner has talked about using that restriction to his benefit. And this speaks to that kind of real strain in Werner Herzog's films, which a lot of people don't often, I don't think, identify. I mean, he does like the water on the lens. He does like very physical camera movement that's moving with characters and almost kind of discovering things in time and space, like a verite film would, right? It goes into a situation, what are we going to discover? And I think there is definitely that quality to the film. I mean, it's interesting that you sort of say with the opening shots coming down the sort of mountainside that, you can feel the physicality. And I think that's right. But at the same time, many would say that shot is so cosmic and so disembodied as well. Say the music of Popol Vuh, for example, this kind of quiet organ, which is very ethereal, and it's never really located in any time or place. It's not associated with any character. It just kind of almost sits there in this ethereal sphere. The characters are very dwarfed by the landscape, overwhelmed by the landscape. Some say it's almost a kind of alienated feel about it. So I think there's also a very cosmic sublime potentially happening in that moment too. And this is one of the interesting things in Herzog's films. Very hard to write about, I must say, Dan, because as one scholar once said, they're very multimodal. In other words, they just have a lot of different things going on in them, and they can often be in a lot of tension. Like you can get something that is very realistic, and yet at the same time, he's trying to elevate it into something very poetic and mysterious and ecstatic. So it's and he can be drawing on different traditions of film or different techniques of film. So he's a hard filmmaker in some ways to really reduce and simplify, I think. And this is one of the things that probably makes him such an enduring and fascinating figure, I think. Yeah.
So one of the things, and I didn't even write about this when I reviewed the film 15 plus years ago, one of the things that sticks in my mind about rewatching it is that the film moves from the hard rock of the Andes down to the water imagery of the Amazon. And here in modern Western culture, maybe not so much when it was filmed, but in since you have the rock as the masculine, and especially in like a lot of lesbian fiction, the water is the feminine. And so you have this going from sort of the masculine to the feminine, from the firm to the sort of the burgeoning insanity. And in the film, the young girl that is there seems to become more and more of a prize, not sexually necessarily for the men, but she seems to become more focused. I'm just wondering if, at the back of his mind, if Herzog may have had that movement from the masculine to the feminine in his as he was doing it, because it seems that 50 years on almost, that seems to be something that for me sticks out in the film.
Look, that's an interesting observation. I couldn't speak to those sort of archetypes particularly necessarily, whether he had that in mind. I would probably note that I think he's a little bit of an asexual filmmaker in many ways. You know, you can make different arguments about whether his, you know, kind of libidinal drive is expressed through the act of filming or something like that maybe, but I don't know how much he really engages with kind of gender, questions of gender and binaries of gender necessarily. But I'm not saying that's not there at all. I think one of the interesting things in that film, though, is probably Kinski's relationship to his daughter in the character arc, because ultimately that is quite an incestuous, alluded as quite an incestuous relationship, where there's a lot of patriarchal dominance over the women as well. I mean, there's both idolization but also patriarchal dominance. And obviously one reading of the film is that really it's all caught up in Aguirre's disillusioned, maniacal spiral into his own insanity, and that his daughter is caught up in that very ego-driven cycle of just spiraling down into a kind of circular madness. So I'm not sure how much room there is for any kind of feminine kind of principles or energies or symbolism necessarily, but I'm open to that reading, Dan. But for me, it's a pretty driven. If we're going to use these sort of archetypes, it's a pretty masculine film from my perspective. Yeah.
Now you mentioned Heart of Darkness. I believe I mentioned the Apocalypse Now, and Apocalypse Now is about a soldier sent to kill this guy who goes mad, Kurtz. In a sense, Aguirre is the Kurtz of this film, and we're seeing sort of the Kurtz end of that whole process and how he became that. But the interesting thing is, there's also a very Rasputin-like quality to Kinski's character, in that he sets up this buffoon who nominally is above him in rank as the sort of dictator on the rafts, and then as the other rafts get dashed on the rocks and whatnot, or they're picked off by the natives, the kingdom that he has, and it's an empire that has shrunk to 1/4 of its minimal size to begin with. Is he making, do you think, a political statement there? And how much of this madness was, again, Herzog letting Kinski just go for it?
Werner will often say he doesn't make political films as such, although I think politics inevitably ends up, of course, in a lot of his films, in part simply because of the subject matter. I mean, you make a film like Lessons of Darkness in Kuwait, in the Gulf War of the early 90s, it's inevitably caught up in politics. I think certainly in some ways I think the insanity and that kind of spiraling down is something, as we've already identified, is a pretty consistent trope in a lot of the characters that Werner wants to explore. He wants to explore men in extreme states. He wants to explore men who react to landscape in particular ways, and almost sometimes, certainly at least in the 70s films, it often felt like or even early 80s, quite a demented reaction was necessary to the extreme landscape experiences. One might, for example, think here of Burden of Dreams, the documentary on Fitzcarraldo, directed by Les Blank, And Les Blanc, I think, is actually quite instructive as an influence on Werner's kind of filmmaking, and including his documentary filmmaking. But, there's that sort of famous sequence. Do you remember, Dan, when he's talking about the jungle? Why he's not a romantic, and he's talking about there's just this endless murder. Even the birds are kind of in torture and so on. Yeah. And, whether you're meant to really take that exactly literally true, it's not necessarily the case. But it does speak to this kind of idea of how do men react to landscape, and what kinds of extremes of the human condition can we explore through the films. So I think that's certainly part of why he wanted, Kinski to perform in that particular way. The subterfuge and the kind of intricacy of, having a puppet, leader and things like that, I think that's probably more just part of the plot of the story and part of Kinski's character as a cunning character and a manipulative character. I think ultimately, too, this film is about, Kinski kind of famously says it in that scene where they are all discussing whether there's a ship in the tree. And there's actually a ship in the tree, right? There's a kind of, in one sense, it is literally there, but obviously in the sense of the story, it's probably a fever dream that the characters have. But the Kinski character says, no, it actually is there. He actually counters the other characters who are questioning it. Some are saying it can't really be there. Kinski says it is there, and we're going to use it to sail to Atlantis. So this is a character who is, in this kind of fever dream world of epic proportions, and is kind of really, in a sense, in a soliloquy of his own imagination. So I think that's a key kind of thematic quality of the film.
So there is, I said he initially doesn't start out. Aguirre doesn't start out as the leader. Another fellow, Seward, does. They sort of get into it back and forth. Seward first puts Aguirre in a prison. Aguirre then weasels his way out. He then has a farcical kangaroo court, and they sentence Seward to death. And then the guy that he has installed as the puppet leader, named Guzman, then pardons Seward, and there is that power play. But in the midst of this, they're going through. So there's the internal. There's the world of the rafts, and then singular raft, and then there's all that's going around it. There's the waterfalls, and then there's the choppy water, and people are dying. Then there's the arrows just coming from all directions at times, picking people off, and we don't see anyone. The only people that we actually see, I believe, are a couple of old people, or a couple of natives that are eventually killed for blasphemy by the religious fellow. So there's the exterior and the interior. Putting aside the Kinski-Herzog dynamic, it's almost as if that has been put into the film, in the sense that the outside is the unseen. That could be taken as Kinski, whereas the machinations on the voyage are sort of the internal, or rather it's Herzog on the outside and Kinski on the inside. Do you think that there was, because from what I've heard, the film had a script, but they also did a lot of improv as accidents happened. Do you think a lot of the Kinski-Herzog relationship was funneled into the actual storyline, in a sense, at least psychically, if you will?
Yeah, maybe unconsciously, indeed. I know certainly, again, it's always about who's reporting on this kind of stuff. So Klaus will take a lot more credibility for certain things, and Werner will say that Klaus is mistaken and it's more about Werner. Werner has certainly conceded that things, I think it's like this certain sort of crab walk and certain sorts of physical acts and use of the way that Kinski would inhabit his costume, and also Klaus's suggestions about costume. They were all things that Werner did concede came from Klaus. So that's certainly some dimension to this. And yeah, Werner's very open to things happening on set, to reacting to environment. He's very big on that kind of thing. And if you read any of his screenplays, sometimes they read a little bit like stories, which then aren't easily translatable to film. The idea is that here are the story ideas and elements of character. The actual physical act of shooting is very important to Werner, and what you do to react to that situation is really important. And that can also include taking opportunities, like, for example, shooting characters like non-actors when they're not aware that they're being shot. He did that in Nosferatu, for example, where there's people who aren't even aware they're not actors. They're like loading a ship, I think it is, from memory, and they're not aware they're being shot. So he does take those sort of opportunities as well. I think the invisibility of the indigenous populations is an interesting one. I think in part, one reading of the film is that it really speaks to the fact that the conquistadors are trying to map and order their experience. And they try to, obviously there's a diary. They're trying to bring, God into the country. They're trying to understand this terrain, but the terrain ultimately always resists their understanding. And there's always something invisible and threatening and other about the landscape. And so that is certainly, I think, one key element to this. So it could be read as kind of a failure, if you like, of some early form of kind of colonialism in terms of its ability to map and navigate the landscape. And so I think that invisible presence is a really interesting kind of aspect to the film. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about the incestuous aspect of Aguirre's daughter there. And so basically after everything sort of breaks down, there's maybe, I think his daughter is shot and dies. At
the end of the film.
At the end of the film, I think there's only maybe one or two people who are still alive, but they're dying of fever. And Aguirre is literally the last man standing. And from what I know, the little, were they capuchin monkeys? I don't know what kind of monkeys they are, overrun the raft. And, this is sort of, the old, chaos coming to the end here. And oddly, the ending reminds me very much of the ending of Hitchcock's Psycho. Now, I'm not a great Hitchcock fan. I think he was too based in Freudian psychology for his characters. And to me, they always seem wooden and out of place to a modern eye. But I think the ending with Perkins restrained and seeing the fly and saying, I wouldn't hurt a fly. I transmute that to Aguirre. He has physical movement. He's not strapped down like Norman, I believe. But here he is talking to the monkeys, sort of saying, I am the last man standing. We will conquer this continent, all of us. And he has that great scene where he picks one of them up and he's looking at it. And then he does sort of, with his hand, he does that little flick, just, like, you do not answer me, you are banished, And so the ending psychologically, number one, do you think, obviously the character has lost it by then, but to me it's almost the reverse dynamic, whereas Norman is going inward, his insanity is just blooming to fill up the cosmos. So if you will, talk a little bit about that ending there, because I really think it's a great ending, and then they're swirling around the raft with the
yeah, absolutely. It's one of the most, I think, one of the things that a lot of people remember from that film, and certainly during its reception, it's one of the most memorable images if you look at any of the critical reception during the 70s and 80s. Look, I think some have argued that there's expressionistic tendencies in some of Werner's films. So that would mean, for example, that you do express an inner quality for external actions through the scenes, through the sets, through the mood, and through the physical actions that characters take. So it's that idea of that an expressionist character is someone who. So I'm talking here about things like German expressionism as an art practice, and we've already mentioned that Werner certainly drew on some classic Weimar, or arguably drew on classic Weimar techniques in his film. So it is this idea that, say, someone like Aguirre, he reacts to the environment, he interiorizes that experience, and then he expresses it through actions. And also that interior reality, that interior insanity is also getting expressed through things that happen to him in the world, right? So that's certainly one reading of what's going on there. But I think there could be something else going on too, that the monkeys, they could be tied to what's happening for him. They could also be tied to a general state of absurdity that's happening in the film as well. And a lot of people talk about that through Werner's work, that he's really interested in like a circle motif. So that means like the camera actually moving, 360 degrees, or characters being stuck in repetition or circular activities. It's kind of this idea of endless repetition, endless kind of just going around in circles in life, and that this is a kind of absurd state. So there could also be something about that, and that ties into this interesting idea that Werner's picked up in the commentary in the DVD, and some other writers have picked up, that we sometimes think that characters are expressing, like when we see a scene in a Herzog film, that a character's state of mind is being expressed, right? Through the torrential rapids, the rapids that are churning in the jungle. This is meant to, in one sense, you can easily read that as meant to be the state of mind of someone like the Lope de Aguirre. And in in My Best Speed, Herzog even talks about the rapids as a kind of metaphor for his and Kinski's relationship. But there's another understanding that is not so much about landscape, physical action, animals necessarily expressing just simply an interior state. It's that the jungle itself has objective properties. In other words, the jungle itself has its own kind of character, which captures a spiritual mood that affects all of us. It's affecting humanity more generally. It's kind of capturing the state of affairs in life. So Herzog at one point says it's not just that the characters are insane, it's the jungle in a sense is insane. And they're actually kind of almost being infected by the jungle. And this is the idea that there's some sort of cosmic metaphysical quality to what's happening. So the monkeys, in other words, aren't just simply an expression of Aguirre's state of mind. They're an expression of what is generally happening for humanity in that moment in the jungle. Does that make sense? Like, it's something that goes beyond the characters.
Yeah, well, I was just going to pick up on that because I mentioned how his state of mind reminded me a bit sort of the inverse of the end of Psycho. But another film's ending that comes to mind is the end of 8.5 by Fellini, where he has the characters dancing in a row. So we've seen all these characters. Some of them have never met within the context of that film's universe, and they're sort of dancing around. So we're clearly in the mind of the director there. We have transcended the fourth wall. Chaos is going loose, except it's not chaos because these are humans. They're dancing in a particular circle. On the other hand, Aguirre, it's almost as if the monkeys have become the members of his crew, replace the humans, but because they're monkeys, they're not going around in a nice, neat circle. I mean, we are going around. We have the cosmic view of going around, but they're just jumping from back and forth, and some of them are terrified. Some of them are eating nuts. Others are climbing on Kinski. And it's almost like it's an absurdist view or an absurdist take on the absurdist end of a Fellini film. So he's almost, in a sense, out-Felliniing Fellini, in a sense.
That's an interesting observation. Yeah, look, I mean, I think absurdity is, a lot of people have written about this and talked about this. Absurdity is pretty key to understanding, I think, Werner Herzog's worldview, right, on the universe and so on. And I think you can see it in a lot of his later works as well, in terms of his view of the future of humanity, and where we're going to end up, and the kind of dreams we have and how absurd those dreams can be. He would, of course, think it's great that we dream. It's great that we have fantasy and imagination, but it's not necessarily going to end in anything other than our own destruction, for example. And, he's certainly been big on apocalyptic themes and imagery, right from Fata Morgana, a very early piece that he did in 1970, 71, right through to Lessons of Darkness, Requiem for a Dying Planet, The Wild Blue Yonder, of course, La Soufriere, documentary he did on the volcano as well, in which he talks about it being like this kind of apocalyptic it kind of evokes this kind of apocalyptic science fiction scenario. So, yeah, I think he's very big on this kind of question of living in an absurd universe where you may endlessly strive for certain things and then come back to have to repeat the whole thing. And that's the famous example of that, among other things, is, of course, Fitzcarraldo. Yeah. So the ship going up the mountainside, then it just kind of gets destroyed. Everything is just kind of futile in a way. But it's almost that you have to affirm the futility, right, as a kind of Camus sort of thing, and that absurdist thing. You have to accept that there is futility to your action, but you have to affirm it nonetheless because you've got no choice. You kind of got suicide, or you affirm your futility of existence. So I think there's a lot of that running through Werner's work, and you get it in the character performances in something like Aguirre. I mean, you get all these characters in tableaus, you get them reacting passively to like dramatic events. Like arrows are being shot at people. There's cannons blowing up rafts and stuff like that. But all the characters are kind of almost out of an absurd theatre piece, aren't they? Really,
yeah.
Like they're kind of just they're not actually dramatically reacting. They're kind of almost just passively watching as spectators of the events that are happening. Except for Kinski, who tends to have the space for a lot more expressive, kind of expressionistic acting. But I think absurdity is for the sort of reasons we've just discussed and a number of others is pretty key to understanding, I think, Herzog's work, unlocking his universe. I think absurdity is definitely a guiding force.
Yeah, and his characters the action, the narrative drive almost seems propelled in most of his films that the characters could get through the films much more easily, but they always make it hard on themselves.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely. He's sort of interesting because he's obviously interested in characters, but in many ways he also makes a lot of non-narrative films in the sense that he's not necessarily going to give you some of that classic. Well, he's definitely not going to give you often a very classic cinema realist resolution. He's not necessarily going to give you different kinds of resolving to your frustration as a narrative, as a viewer in terms of what's happening in the story. I think he also does clearly some things, and this is the thing about the monkey too. We can just go back to that. There's so much to say about the monkeys, I think. But one thing that really attracted me to Werner was that while we're talking about all these things like absurdity and so on, the sublime, the insanity of characters, the jungle impacting the characters, there's also just moments where the images just really almost just stand on their own onto themselves as their own kind of reality. I mean, shots like the rapids, for example, in Aguirre, that's one of the first things that really attracted me to Werner was this hypnotic quality of just punctuating the narrative with shots that don't actually progress the story at all. They really stand outside the time and space of the story.
The scenes of the rapids, for example, and exactly. Then out of nowhere in the Amazon jungle, there's a cow that I think appears, or is it a bull that appears on the edge? Right. I mean, and a cow like that—that's a very Fellini thing, Amico.
Sure. Yeah. So this is also another attraction to me for Werner is the way he'll spend time just shooting landscape, whether it's Nosferatu, Wild Blue Yonder, Encounters at the End of the World, all those underwater shots that he'll just spend time with. It's what's sometimes been described as kind of dead time. It's time that doesn't propel the narrative. Yeah. It's time that kind of stands out of the diegesis, in other words, of everything that creates that story world.
Yeah.
This is a really fascinating quality, I think, of his work.
It's interesting you mentioned Fata Morgana. That's actually probably one of my the most interesting documentaries he did, and I think it had a great influence on Godfrey Reggio's Qatsi films that came later. I don't know if you've seen those films.
Haven't, no.
Okay, they're documentaries that show the progress of man and the futility. There's a trilogy of them. But anyway, that brings me on to. I just want to talk a little bit about the reception of the film and also the music, since you mentioned Popol Vuh. The music there, of course, is non-diegetic, except for some maybe tom-tom beats that we hear on the shore. But speak just a little bit about the choice, because I don't think they were known, or even that kind of music was known before this film. One of the things it does put in mind to me the score of Planet of the Apes. It does give an otherworldly kind of feel, even though we're very much on Earth here.
Yeah, that's right. And Florian Frickel, I think. Yeah. Frickel, I think I pronounced that correctly, from Popol Vuh. So Werner formed a relationship with him pretty early on, and they worked collaboratively together on a number of films. And obviously Popol Vuh are part of that German rock movement of the 1970s. and they're part of that strand that I guess is more largely influenced by things like folk and roots music, and eventually they became a kind of world music band. Yeah, I think that as I understand it, the quiet organ is kind of is this really interesting kind of sound that's produced in this particular film, and I think as we mentioned earlier, it has a really ethereal, disembodied quality because it's not really attached to any particular location, to any particular character. And so some have definitely suggested that it helps to very much create an experience in which there is some sort of presence in the landscape. So this is this idea that there's something cosmic happening here, that it helps to elevate you into a space in which you're not just connected to character, you're not even just connected to the landscape. It's like everything is elevated above that, and there's something else here. There's some other kind of presence. I'm not necessarily suggesting it's God or anything divine, but it's just a kind of cosmic metaphysical presence. So this is one reading of the film, that music really helps to create that kind of atmosphere. Werner was a big fan of Popol Vuh for quite a while. He did, I think, eventually just sort of have a creative fallout with Florian. Eventually, they just didn't meet eye to eye on what the creative outputs were. But they worked on things like Nosferatu. I think maybe Cobra Verde. I could be wrong there. There's definitely a few films in which they're involved. And I think for Werner, it's often about ways that you can create ambiguity, mystery, elusiveness, and what he calls poetic ecstatic truth. And that the music here definitely helps to perform that kind of function for him.
So the film itself, when it came out, from what I've read, it had generally positive reviews, and it seems to have grown in stature over the last almost 5 decades, and it regularly makes top 50 or top 100 lists of cult films, films in general, or German films, and whatnot. What is your take on the film and the critical reception? Do you think that it compare when it came out to now, how it's seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing it does really well. I mean, I was thinking about. I thought you might ask this question, so I was having a think about it the other day, and I remember having a conversation with a very erudite colleague of mine who is not a Herzog fan, but one of the films he always did enjoy is Aguirre, and I wondered about that. And I think it does continue to work in a way because it's got some strong absurd comedy. There's absurdity in terms of alienation and maybe some more, kind of disheartening themes maybe, but there's also kind of comedy in the film. I think the physicality of the jungle and the way that's elevated through the music and through other techniques has helped to really create a very strong piece that still seems to stand out even to today. I think in the 1970s, obviously, it's going to be contextualized in terms of a whole bunch of new wave movements, as you've already mentioned, about European cinemas, New Hollywood, of course, something like Apocalypse Now that comes out a bit later. And Francis, I believe, has mentioned that Aguirre was an influence on that film. I think the 1970s, and I thought an interesting question here too, Dan, is about how we categorize what kind of film Aguirre is. And we shouldn't forget that there was, for example, a whole series of road movies in the 1970s. And in a way, it's an epic quest adventure film. It's a jungle film. It's an absurd film, darkly comical, but it's a kind of road movie. You could class it in a way, right? It's just water rather than road. And so, it's sort of easy to imagine how it can get contextualized in terms of some of those other trends and movies happening at that time as well. But I think it's one of it is still quite accessible for one of Werner's films. It's slow cinema, but I think the various qualities of it, as just mentioned, blend in a way that still remains compelling and enjoyable for audiences. And it's probably more accessible than something like Heart of Glass or even Enigma of Casper House or something like that, which I think are a lot more probably experimental and push the boundaries of audiences' experiences of time and story, where I think Aguirre still has enough kind of cues and signposts along the way in terms of being a quest film, an adventure film, historical epic, kind of spiraling down into this insanity. You kind of mentioned Rasputin and things like that. This kind of classic tale of power, subterfuge, and just those compelling experiences of landscape. That those qualities really mixed in a way that's just remained strong, I think, over a number of decades. Let's also face it, Werner has not disappeared from the world, has he? I mean, he maintains his auteur presence right up to today. He's doing productions on Netflix, so he is part of the popular culture landscape. There's no doubt about that as well. So that all helps, I think.
So let's. I included this film, and I want to end up with your take on why people should watch it, why you think it's great. But before we do that, I just wanted to say that the reason I chose this film, and I think he has other great films, some of them we've mentioned, Nosferatu, I think is probably his second best film. But I think for me, this is the most Herzogian. It's the most balls to the wall. There's no relent. There's no concessions to formal narrative. There's no concessions to the political milieu of the day. Only I think Nosferatu rivals it in that. But since that was already a remake, this has to be considered his most Herzogian film. And it's sort of the unapologetic id of Herzog running wild. I mean, yes, you could say something like Dwarf Started Small is crazier, it's odder, but in terms of having that, you can see the light at the end of the proverbial tunnel, and Herzog just zooms towards it. That's why I think it's his best film, and why I want to do it. Would you agree with that assessment? And if not, give your reason for why you think this is a great film and people who haven't seen it should.
I think probably, it's slow art cinema in a certain sense, depending on one's sensibility. But yeah, you're probably right. There's a certain sort of economy or efficiency of style to the film that maybe is lacking in some of the other ones. So that does help audiences to really zoom into the end of that film and to follow the story and follow what happens with Aguirre as events progress. I think, there's a lot of reasons to watch Aguirre. I think apart from the influences on other films, like we mentioned, Apocalypse, I believe maybe Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain as well, I think cites some influences, and I think you're going to find a number of other films cite influences from Aguirre. I think it's, it's still a really strong example of 70s European art cinema at the time as well. I think it's a great emblematic example of Kinski's abilities as a performer. And I think as a jungle film, so those who are interested in those sorts of epic films, loosely based on historical facts, set in jungles, and those who might have seen Fitzcarraldo, who haven't seen other earlier Werner Herzog films, it's obviously a great companion piece to Fitzcarraldo. And it's also, as we mentioned, I think, it does have some kind of cosmic comical qualities to it too that I think stand up in terms of kind of absurdity, sometimes almost kind of surreal qualities that I still think speak well to audiences today. I think, it still remains one of his more accessible films, probably from that period as well. So it's a good entry point if people haven't seen many of the earlier Werner films. A lot of people have probably seen more of the documentaries, as you mentioned, Dan. It's a very strong streak of his filmmaking. And so a lot of people might have seen things like Inferno more recently, or Grizzly Man, or Encounters at the End of the World. So this gives you a really good sense of the early way that Herzog was starting to construct his films. And it does have a really strong sense. I think you're right. I think it has a very strong sense of his authorial presence as an auteur in this film. It's, he's always been pretty strong about what he wants and his vision. And this is definitely a really good exemplar of that. Yeah.
Well, TysonWills.com is your website. I'll link to that below. It's Wills with just one L, not two, with just one L.
That's right.
And I want to thank you for spending an hour talking about the film with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.